All right. So to kick things off, um, in EB-5, what do we all see as the state of play in EB-5 today? And what are our biggest challenges? And on the flip side, our biggest opportunities. Sometimes they're the flip sides of the same coin. So I'd love, Tom, would you kick us off here? What do you think based on your experience? Where are we today?
I mean, I think we're okay. I think we have been successful in meeting the policy goals of the Reform Act. I think that's a big deal. I think we frankly, I'll give you a little. We're about to put out a white paper on what's been going on for the past 3 years since the RIA, and one of the statistics that we came up with, and we have it's a stellar group, but there's been a 1,500% increase in investment in rural areas. So that's significant. That's what Grassley, Senator Leahy wanted. They are getting exactly what they wanted. Um, and I think that's meaningful. And I think that helps us going forward. I also look, I think in today's environment, and we'll talk about it, the economics of today's environment are very, very difficult. I mean, frankly, it reminds me closer to 2008, 2009, maybe not that terrible, but pretty close. And there's a huge, huge demand for EB-5. Now, obviously, with those huge demands comes some risks, and we can discuss them. But there's a huge opportunity, and I think legislatively we're in a good spot because people, the idea that you can get an investment that creates jobs and it doesn't cost taxpayers any money. There's bipartisan support for that, and in the terms of this economy, I think that's obviously going to grow. The debt, the challenges clearly are the same ones we've always had: the backlog, the retrogression, and in this instance, with the grandfathering of 1 year before the end of the program with people who are grandfathered as of September of 26 rather than September of 27. So um, that's just my $20,000 foot, view of what's going on.
Totally. Yes. So, just to explain that a little bit to folks, the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act, which reauthorized and re-energized the EB-5 program in 2022, will sunset in 2027, September 30, 2027. The law has grandfathering provisions that protect EB-5 investors' processes, even if the program terminates and we have a lapse, which we hope will not happen, and we're working very hard to avoid that. But if it did, investors who invested in the RIA would be protected, would be grandfathered. But there's a mismatch between the grandfathering sunset and the RIA sunset, with the grandfathering sunsetting a year earlier, September 30, 2026. So that is a challenge indeed for us all. Ira, what do you see as our biggest challenges and opportunities?
Well, I think Congress in 1990 intended the program to be one of economic development and to give jobs. In fact, the fight on the floor of the Senate was that we didn't just want to have a program where people could buy their way into the US, but we wanted a program that would actually help with economic development. I think the program today is much closer to what Congress wanted in 1990, and precisely because of what Tom was said before, which is you're seeing more rural development, you're seeing more infrastructure development, you're seeing more jobs created in areas of the country where people don't have jobs or didn't have jobs. So I think in the sense of the correction that RIA made, that you were talking about, Carolyn, that there's been a positive change, kind of forcing people instead of, these giant projects that were done in the major US cities. We're now seeing projects that I think are much more attuned to what Congress intended. And I think that's a big selling point, by the way, to continue the program. And I guess we'll talk about that a little bit later. The obvious problems are the problems of the current immigration environment, where the administration is taking a very hard line policy with respect to certain immigrants. They have tended to do it across the board. So one of the things I think we'll get into talking about is when applications are denied, what happens to people? They never were detained before. Some people are being detained now, or at least the government's, making noises like they're going to detain people. And so that creates, a kind of negative environment if your application's denied. But I think we'll also see a big rush, as we have traditionally seen, when there is a deadline for filing. I think we're going to get more and more applications. I think the projects themselves are much better, so that people in the end have a better shot at ultimately not only fulfilling what Congress wanted, but getting their residency and getting their money back, and creating jobs for Americans.
That's a very hopeful note to end on. Thank you, Ira. And to kick us off on, Ron, what do you see as our biggest challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, I agree that the RIA has been very successful, and this is an example of bipartisan legislation where Congress should be taking a victory lap because they got it right. And I think to a large extent, these are the good old days. Right now, I think the next year is going to be a huge year for EB-5. Everyone will be wanting to invest before the end of the grandfathering on September 30, 2026. I think there'll be a need for more good projects than ever because of the great investor demand. I think it doesn't hurt that as part of this whole gold card thing, which we'll talk about, the president has endorsed investment immigration as really a primary mode of immigration, maybe the primary mode of immigration. I think that's a good thing. Are there challenges? By all means, there are challenges. 2020, it's the first time we're dealing with needing to extend the regional center program a year before it expires. Because if we don't extend in 2026, my crystal ball is not as rosy for what happens after September 30, 2026 until we get an extension. What a challenge it is to try to get Congress to understand that they need to extend a year in advance a deadline of September 30, 2027. To me, that's a huge challenge for the industry. Another challenge is we are dealing with an agency that has a history of being inconsistent. And we're seeing that in a number of areas that I'll at least introduce, and maybe we'll get into more detail later. But we've seen situations, actually a lot of situations now, where USCIS approved source of funds in approving the I-526, and now they're denying source of funds at the 829 stage, saying, basically, we changed our mind. That's outrageous and wrong.
Decoupling.
Yeah.
Decoupling the 526 from the 829.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Just within the last couple weeks, we've seen situations where many investors have taken advantage of loan programs that are offered to them by the regional center. And there's many examples of approvals until there aren't. And just within the last 2 weeks, we've started seeing denials and revocations. Another example where the agency is inconsistent makes it difficult to rely on what they're doing. And I guess the last thing, the challenge, picking up on what Ira said, is, let's face it, we're dealing with an administration that is not the most immigrant friendly. And this is, at base, an immigration program. To some extent, it helps EB-5 because a lot of the restrictions in non-EB-5 areas may be more harsh than whatever we're seeing in EB-5, which may make people gravitate to EB-5. But I do expect with this administration, we'll see increasing delays, and that will create its own set of challenges.
Well, thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ron, for those perspectives. Enrique, what do you see as our biggest challenges and opportunities?
So I feel like the cleanup batter here in the baseball game, batting fourth. So I'll get to summarize what everyone basically said so as not to be repetitive. But I see three challenges and I see three opportunities at a minimum. First, on the opportunities, it's the strongest program I think that any of us has seen during our lifetimes, given that the program started in our lifetimes. And so it's a really strong program. But what are the other opportunities? The priority processing because of the rural projects. That's really pushed to the forefront why rural programs, rural projects are so popular compared to 5-10 years back. There's also the ability to file both the first step, the 526, and the second step here in the US, the I-485 concurrently. Now, with that said, I was looking at that as an opportunity previously, but what we've seen out of USCIS lately, that one could straddle the opportunity challenge because of the possibility if you enter as a tourist um, and your underlying status expires, that they may issue you a notice to appear in immigration court because your underlying status expired while you're waiting for your application to be approved. So could be an opportunity, could be a challenge. Challenges, clearly, what we refer to in the industry as retrogression, which is the unavailability of the immigrant visas under the annual quota for the non-rural projects, the non-priority projects. The costs. The costs have increased over 200% just for the application fee. The project cost, the 800,000 is still, or 1.05 million, still the same. And then the final one is on Ron's note, more scrutiny, a lot more scrutiny than what we have seen on these applications, especially when they're coming back and re-adjudicating something that they've previously approved. That's how I look at it on opportunities and challenges.